obviously the US sees China as a competitor that they want to stop. They want to stop the rise of China. And so, yeah, of course, propaganda-wise, we're hearing all these headlines about China collapsing at any moment. The economy's collapsing, everything's collapsing. But if you can see, we're going to put up a World Economic Outlook little graph that predicts that China's growth in 2025 is going to be 4.5% versus the US's 2.2%. So obviously, China's still going to be rising, expanding a little bit more than the US. However, Trump has a solution for this. And his solution, of course, is anti-China tariffs. We're going to just show a little clip of that just so that we can see Trump's love of tariffs.
The Detroit situation. And we want to bring back company, and we're going to bring them back because you know why? The most beautiful word in the entire dictionary, you know what it is? It's tariff. The tariff. You're going to become so rich with the word tariff. You're going to become rich as hell. You're not going to know what to do with the money. I'm telling you.
Yeah, so you can see from this clip, Trump is doubling down on his strategy of tariffs. And this time around, Trump is promising a blanket tariff of 10% to 20% on nearly all imports and 60% or more on Chinese goods. However, a recent analysis by the Peterson Institute of International Economics found that if Trump did impose a 10% on all goods and a 60% on China, it would cost a typical household in the middle of the income distribution about $1,700 in increased expenses each year. So, Anna, we're going to have you, if you can, speak on the impact of these policies on everyday Americans. And also, how do you think China will deal with this escalating new Cold War?
Well, when you start talking about tariffs, I mean, we've been through this before. It's like first timers farce, second timers farce. All the media seems to be incredible denial. I mean, I'm just appalled across the board. You know, poor Jill Stein and Cornel West, who I think I might actually have voted for, they didn't get a look in. And of course, the Americans were cheated of having the full range of opinions. You've got this weird, very strong polarization now, but it's within such a narrow channel. There is such narrow bandwidth there. So it was a staggering victory. And I think a lot of us were left wondering, well, how bad did Biden's performance over his 4-year term have to be for the American electorate to welcome Trump back from the politically dead? You know, like every screen monster, we thought he'd been killed off in the final reel of the original movie. Yet here he is back again with his tiny hands on the levers of power, and 4 more years of this. So I'm calling this the sequel, Interesting Times 2, and this time it's personal. I think a lot of people are going to be extremely nervous that he's back in power. So for everyone wondering how the heck did this happen, you could say, well, it's the economy, stupid, to use a very, very worn cliche. So there's no excuse in not knowing this, but it's all the other issues as well. I mean, of course, Roe v. Wade was important, but in 4 years, what moves did Biden and Kamala make to actually reverse that? It just seemed to be getting worse and worse. So Americans obviously aren't feeling the economy is doing any better under Biden, unlike what we've been told. You know, I've been watching a whole load of stuff on the American media and they're saying, oh, but he's done this, he's done that. It's just so much better. You know, like Matt said, 60% of people just aren't definitely not feeling it. You have all the footage of people, the homeless people or on drugs, just this weird thing that's going on in the streets of America. In the wealthiest country in the world, this is happening. So on top of that, they're seeing billions of tax dollars being sent to the bottomless pit of war, the chief beneficiary being the military-industrial complex war machine. They're seeing the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza and the prospect of another endless war, possibly engulfing the whole of the Middle East. They see a crackdown in democracy from crushing protests to ending media independence, and they're really not getting anything better. So for many, the only growth areas have been poverty, drug addiction, homelessness, and despair. Unfortunately, voters seem to be associating better times with Trump's first few years in power before COVID. That was before he started firing torpedoes at our lifeboat and global growth engine. America was living beyond its means after its great crash of 2008, and they still weren't out of the woods, even though China had come to the rescue, which everyone seems to be forgetting. It's been forgotten that Trump pressured Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve, which is private, not state-owned, to keep bank rates down in order to inflate the markets. And markets, of course, are not the same as the economy. And that's how we got the Trump pump. I remember that well until the Black Swan event of COVID that did what we were all expecting, crashed it so the rich could reload, having sold their stocks and shares the night before. So in this sugar rush delusion, everyone lost perspective. The nation racked up unimaginable debt, now standing at $36 trillion. And there is no legitimate way out of that. And the worry is, of course, classically, there's one way to get yourself out of that sort of problem, and that is war. Yet again, it's like being one long war with America. So manufacturing still hasn't been brought home. How little would you have to pay an American worker to make a smartphone or an electric vehicle affordable for the average consumer if it's not being made cheaply abroad? So instead of building a concrete base to their reality, the US concocted an illusion spun out of candy floss and fairy dust, it seems. And the American dream is now a coma dream, and I wish they'd all snap out of it. When he started his hybrid war on China, he launched the trade war in 2017, 2018. Trump imposed these huge tariffs that the US consumer pays. And it seems that we all had to argue that for a long time before the penny dropped. So he's doing that all over again, except even more. So that's how he kickstarted inflation and brought America's recovery from the Great Crash to a crashing end. Because do you remember, for the beginning of the 21st century, inflation was near zero. And it's like people need to join the dots and work out, well, if our stuff is being made really cheaply and lots of it in China, and we're able as a nation to live beyond our means, then what does that mean if he suddenly, takes a wrecking ball to that? So people are surprised there's inflation. So, of course, someone has to be held to account for this sorry state of affairs. So who is it that they blame? Oh, China. So in picking on China, they get a 2-for-1, because China is both a scapegoat and the golden goose that's envied by an ailing Western system at the end of its cycle. So welcome to late capitalism. We're at the bit where it eats itself. And I said way back that China was the newly rich kid wearing a Rolex who'd strayed onto mafia turf and was about to get rolled. I knew as soon as Western leaders saw China's beautiful cities, growing wealth and social cohesion, that they'd want to knock it down like an angry toddler at the beach, stomping on other kids' sandcastles. And here we are. There's no logic to it. They're driven by so much envy, and never mind greenbacks. It's like the green-eyed monster is in charge of everything. So after years of acting as lowly factory to the world, China's finally caught up with the US and is overtaking it, both economically and technologically. And China is resented, not because it's doing anything wrong, because it's not, but because America's ruling elite rested on its laurels. The richest nation on the planet failed to invest in infrastructure and its people. It sucked the economy dry with vast profits and tax cuts until the top 1% holds about as much wealth as the bottom 90%. And today, even Elon Musk acknowledges that the country is going bankrupt. So the US and its mates have to get the Viking raiding party together. They aim to stop China's continued development and pillage the village. And to sally forth into this primitive act of destructiveness like Dark Age berserkers, they have to get I'm sorry, I do see Trump and the rest like with these shields, banging on their shields at these Nuremberg rally type things. But they have to get the taxpayers on board, as has been pointed out by various think tanks such as SimSec. I remember them saying that about 5 years ago. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is what they're going to be doing to brainwash the electorate, the American people. And that's exactly what they've been focusing on, because this is exactly what they're good at. And remember, it is America's Madison Avenue that established an army of psychologists and media in the advertising industry. And they're all expert at mass manipulation to persuade you to buy stuff you never knew you needed, or that new war that will look great hanging up in the closet next to the Armani. So we've seen this raft of laws targeting China, such as the American Competes Act of 2022. Instead of cooperating with China on stabilizing the world and combating climate change while we still have a chance, Biden failed to reverse Trump's aggression towards the country they decided to target as a rival. Biden doubled down and brought in his own China hate bounty, the state-funded character assassination project that started at $500 million and now it's budgeted at $1.6 billion just to monster the rising superpower. So we have to remember that China was the stabilizing factor of the past 2.5 decades. And of course, this is just being covered up all the time. We're being gaslighted terribly about this. So while the US was on the rampage against the Patriot Act of 2001, resulting in the deaths of millions of Muslims, China was lifting 800 million of its own people out of poverty and creating this huge middle class with a stake in the world. It's a middle class almost twice the size of the population of the US. And we know it's never had a war or fired a shot in anger in 40 years. So how did they keep inflation so low at the beginning of the 21st century when there was stability? You know, it really felt like, at least, apart from a few hotspots, the usual hotspots, Palestine, unfortunately, being one, there did seem to be relative stability in the world after America seemed to be satisfied with their bloodletting, the Patriot Act bloodletting. So the reason they managed to keep inflation down was that China was the West's factory, making our affordable goods. So how did they do that? In part, it was huge economies of scale of production, which America doesn't have. China also had to cope, remember, with the manufacturing pollution that was transferred along there with the West's manufacturing, and necessity being the mother of invention. They are now the world's most advanced producer of renewables. I think it's ironic that every time they're hit with something like, chips, they're being denied chips, they suddenly leapfrog everyone and they just do even better. It's quite entertaining to watch that. So they did all these things to help stabilize America's broken economy. They bought US treasuries, they acted as a shock absorber, bought US treasuries, they allowed global currencies to devalue against the yuan, taking the hit themselves. They encouraged consumption by their new middle class, and they embarked on an infrastructure campaign that also stimulated the global economy. And hawks conveniently forget that Wall Street made a mint of China. Not only the goods they produced there for domestic consumption at home, but also the in-country goods and services sold to the Chinese market, which made up around half of their profits. And he's going to wreck that. So as Trump threatens 60% tariffs on all goods from China and sanctions on China's trade partners, some are now saying de-Americanize has now become a guiding principle for American business as well as China. So in the face of economic and military threats by America, China's now selling its US treasuries. They're doing it slowly and responsibly. Some of us would say, you need to dump the whole lot at once, but they're not doing that. They're being very grown up about it. The US only has itself to blame for devaluing and weaponizing its own dollar, which is the world's currency reserve. They've absolutely screwed the pooch. It's just unbelievable to watch. All this time, Biden was supposed to have been working together with China to battle climate change. He had 4 years to get that going. Instead, he started wars across the world. And apart from all the killing and the destruction, war is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. The US military, being bigger than the next 9 or 10 countries put together, is the worst polluter of all. It accounts for over 40% of the world's military spending, and yet it points an accusing finger at China. And when you point the finger, altogether, we know what this means. 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So I'll finish on this Thucydides trap. Is it inevitable that we're going to go to war? The late capitalism move to war was always likely, but not inevitable. If your analysis shows that this destructive trajectory is the only possible outcome, if events are left to unfold by themselves, then we are screwed. But if you have faith in human ingenuity to change the course of history for the better, then that's what we should be doing. Unfortunately, the 2 candidates, Trump and Harris, are like machines on a set course, incapable of acting beyond the mechanistic imperatives of might is right. It's an ugly combination of jungle law with machine logic. It shows the limits of their thinking in a very narrow bandwidth. The whole thing is a right shower. Thankfully, China and the global south can see what's coming down at the pike. They know that the light at the end of the tunnel is a train coming straight at them, so they're taking evasive and preventative action. BRICS is a trade alliance that could yet save the world again.